Hello, my name is Matthew Sortino and welcome to Their Stories Unbroken. Although Their Stories Unbroken aims to bear witness to the Holocaust itself, another purpose of the podcast is to explore the impact of the Shoah on descendants of survivors. I feel so privileged to be able to spend time with multiple generations within families, to hear their stories, and help weave a tapestry of experiences of the Melbourne Jewish community and beyond. In today's episode, I am speaking to Adele Stowe-Lindner. Adele is the daughter of Stephen Lindner, my guest in the previous episode, and is married to Jeremy, who featured in episode 1. This conversation finishes the first mini-series of the season. Their Stories Unbroken will continue to release episodes in this manner. As time goes on, less and less survivors of the Holocaust are with us today. But their stories live on through their ancestors, and it is through second and third generation survivors that we can continue to learn about the legacy of the Shoah. I have many interviews with families organised over the next few weeks and months, so please subscribe to the podcast to ensure episodes go straight into your podcast feed when released. It would also be amazing if you could share Their Stories Unbroken with friends and family and leave a review on the platform of your choice, as it really does help extend the reach of the podcast. Finally, if you do want to get in touch or have a story of your own to share, please email theirstoriesunbroken@gmail.com. Adele Stowe-Lindner is Executive Director of an organisation which trains charity boards and leaders in leadership and ethical governance. With 20 years' experience in not-for-profit leadership in London and Melbourne, including the homeless, refugee and educational disadvantaged sectors, she is passionate about building strong communities. Adele has a Masters of Community Work and a Masters of Leadership. Adele has previously sat on the board of her synagogue and currently sits on the boards of Zionist Federation Australia and Maccabi Tennis Club. She has 2 children and a husband currently at Bialik College. In part 1 of the podcast, we discussed Adele's early life, her interest in community, connection and identity, Jewish education and empowerment, and the impact of Adele's maternal grandparents, Anna and Emanuel, and paternal grandparents, Wanda and Rafal, on her life. In part 2, Adele shares the stories of her grandparents' survival during the Shoah, and how this has impacted every aspect of her life, whether it be daily parenting choices or the need to find meaning in every hour and every day. The fact that others survived so she could live against the odds and through unfathomable traumatic actions has given her a compulsion to make every second count while she's alive. In part 3, we talk about Adele's career, work ethic and values, and how these were influenced by her parents and grandparents. We also discuss anti-Semitism and life post-October 7. I am thrilled to share this conversation today. So without further delay, I bring you Adele Stowe-Lindner. Adele, welcome to Their Stories Unbroken.
Thanks for having me.
Adele, I'd love for you to start with a little bit about you and your early life. Where did you grow up? A little bit about your parents. We've already heard from Stephen in the podcast, but your parents, both sides, and what was life like in your early childhood?
I grew up in Kew, which at the time when I was very small, it was a fairly local community when I went to school. So I went to school in a Jewish school from kinder for 2 years and then prep grade 1, grade 2. Even at that time, it was obvious that there was something a little bit different about the Jewish community of that area, partly because there were 14 children in my class all the way from little kinder to grade 2, and I can still name every single one of them and what they do. So people in some way stayed in touch or knew of other people who went to that school because there were so few people. In the year above me, there was 1 girl, for example. So it was a Jewish school, but it was very, very small, and it was connected to a synagogue. It was about a 15-minute walk from my house. And I went to activities after school that were with the broader community. So I did ballet, as you do when you're 5 and 6 year old girl in Balwyn. My swimming lessons were at the City Baths, which is in the centre of the city. And whilst I didn't think anything of it when I was very little, as I moved into grade 3, grade 4 in the main school, and I caught the bus to where people were coming from Caulfield, the other side of town, I became more aware that I was spending more time with kids from non-Jewish backgrounds than probably a lot of my friends. We had Shabbat dinner at my grandparents' house every week, my dad's parents. My mum's parents would look after us every Thursday and cook, teach us maths. My grandfather on my mum's side is a maths professor, so that was his happy place. And in terms of a Jewish background, the context of our family friends, for example, was largely Jewish, except for my dad's best friend who was not Jewish, and so we were very close with that family. They were also from the countryside, from Castlemaine, so really off the beaten track when everyone else you know lives in Doncaster or Caulfield. But our family friends were Jewish, and we had the Shabbat dinner, but it was a very cultural expression of Judaism. So from when I was probably in early secondary school, a lot of the practice in the house ended up led because I was interested in doing it. So I would walk to shul on festivals, on Yom Tov, because I wanted to be part of the community where my parents would be at work.
What made you want to have that deeper connection than the connection your parents had with Judaism?
It's something I've thought about and I don't know the answer. I think some people, when students go to Jewish schools, some people information lands from teachers differently for some people than for others. So there might be some natural inclination to feel curious or interested or spiritually connected for some people more than for others. I think for a lot of people it's their family, but for me it wasn't. And sometimes it's an inspiring teacher. I did have an inspiring teacher in Year 9, but I was already interested before then. So I can't explain except for that I really wanted to be part of a community. And for me, being part of a community, that was my kind of inner drive, meant doing the things with the community.
For the audience that may not have been in a Jewish school or have any idea of what it's like, what would you say are some of the differences and also some of the similarities with a non-Jewish, a mainstream school, or I guess there's a difference between public and independent too, but what was your school like in comparison?
I've actually spent a lot of time in a lot of different schools because I worked for 8 years in a charity which worked with government schools across Australia. Some of the difference, I can't say the main difference, I would say some of the differences of a Jewish environment is the community marking of particular events, which I believe create a large amount of nostalgia and normalisation, and that creates memory and attachment to the community. So dressing in blue and white for a particular day, the dress-up day in a Jewish school is Purim, to celebrate a festival. So it's something that means something over, for example, Book Week. So that's what alumni will remember long after they've left, and that can motivate their choices in their own practice with their own families, or if they don't have a family by themselves at later time, whether they want to be part of that again and be part of that community. So some of it is hands, like practice, together with community. I think I'm very passionate about literacy. As a young adult, I really enjoyed reclaiming Judaism for myself and my peers, together with my peers. So writing a new Haggadah, thinking about different ways to keep the values of Yom Kippur, but in our own way, often in an opposite way to the halachic or the kind of Jewish legal practice, or what you should be doing. You can only do that and reclaim it and make a connection if you're literate. So the Jewish schools are exposing students to taking up a literacy. Part of that is Hebrew, which is our own language. So being able to read our own literature and interpret it for ourselves, there's a huge amount of empowerment in that, and that can help with our identity. So I think that that's kind of key differences between a Jewish environment and a non-Jewish environment, whatever that non-Jewish environment might be.
Do you think you said you and your friends, but unique in the way that you wanted to do that, reframe it in a way that suited you? Was that something that everyone at your school seemed to be doing, or was that something particularly of interest to you?
My school was not like that, no. I actually, when I started questioning and thinking, I actually don't think I believe in God, that was actually shameful, and I didn't share that question with anyone. So no, but it definitely gave the exposure and the opportunity for literacy that I needed in order to reframe things and try and be creative. That creativity, that was definitely, I'm not alone in that, and I'm not a leader in that. There's a really long and very rich history of secular or cultural Judaism. The kibbutzim were on the forefront of that even before the State of Israel was established. And again, a lot of the people that they were inspired by were people who had a lot of Jewish literacy, and so they could understand their texts and reinterpret them for themselves to be thinking, what's the core meaning of this festival, and therefore what is a modern practice which would make sure that I have awareness and am expressing the intention of the meaning of this festival.
Do you think that is something that is accepted more broadly in Judaism compared to other religions or other even beliefs?
Yes, I spend a lot of time with people of Catholic faith or who grew up Catholic but no longer practice through work, and it's always a source of humour and incredulity to them when I will come in and, for example, after Yom Kippur, mention that I'd been reading a particular book in shul, in synagogue, and where I'd been, by the way, all day and hungry. And they would say, what do you mean you're reading this book? And I say, it's a spiritual Jewish book. So I've chosen it on purpose to be reading in my downtime, but I wasn't praying all day. I was in the environment. And that's not a particularly creative expression of a festival, but it's definitely a freedom that, because Judaism is not only a faith, it's in fact other things before it's a faith, there is a huge amount of space for creativity, and Jewish communities to this day in all different countries are finding their way to connect to community in the way that means something for them.
Yeah, and that's what I've noticed being here at Bialik, and what I've loved about being here and with a pluralist school. Everyone comes in with a different set of beliefs and attachment, and whether they're religious or secular, believe in God or not, it's just an amazing way to, as you said, with all the different events and celebrations, there's a togetherness and an identity there, but it's not, one size fits all. And I grew up Catholic and I'm not religious anymore. And that sort of like you go, okay, Catholicism's gone from my life now. But then you go, but there's so many Italian, my background's Italian, festivals that are associated with that. Why? Because I don't believe in God, have I lost all of that? Why do I have to now say Christmas is Santa? Can't it still be about the story of the religion, and we take what we can, as you said, rewriting some of the meaning for you and for a modern you and for others in this modern time? Why do we have to completely abandon it and say, yep, it's gone from my life? Or we have to hold on to it and force ourselves to believe in this God and some of the negatives that come along with ancient religions as well. So, and I see that today with a lot of people baptising their kids and sending them to Catholic schools when they say, I don't believe in God, but I want that. But why then is there this forced nature of people say, well, I better believe in God then, I better start, can we not have that identity? And I know it's different with Judaism because it's beyond, Catholicism was this idea of universalism as a religion and not as a cultural identity as such, but I love Judaism for that reason, and the fact that I've been completely brought in, and as long as I'm open, everyone's open to share anything with me and what it means and bring me along with it, and it's not this closed off thing that you often feel from outside that people believe it is. It's very inviting and accepting, at least in my experience. So yeah, I don't know to react to that. It's not really a question, but yeah, have you thought much about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in Jewish communities, we really celebrate. This is not a soundbite that can be separated or taken out of context. We celebrate hypocrisy in a very beautiful, deep and spiritual way. We are pick and choose. We are, you want to do this today, you want to do something tomorrow. We have a cultural kind of sentence, na'aseh v'nishma, we'll do it and then it will mean something to you. It's almost like CBT, do the behaviours and then you'll find some meaning. And that in itself has a large amount of hypocrisy in it. We don't care at the moment to what extent or what type of meaning or layer you've put on this practice. Make it your own. What you do today might be different to tomorrow. We have a long history of communities, not every Jewish community, but definitely many of them and over many periods and in many countries of engaging in the world around us, like Maimonides, for example, and certainly in my family, of my great-grandfather was a rabbi who was also a pharmacist who studied abroad, and he was brought up, this is my great-grandfather, right? Like it's a long time ago, and he was brought up in speaking Yiddish, his home language, and also Russian and Polish because they lived on the border. And his mum, single mother, brought him up to know the language of the people around him and to connect with the people around him. And if you're going to connect to the people around you, then you also gives you pause for looking at your own culture from another perspective. So I feel like that standing with one foot in one world and one foot in another world, we have a really long tradition over different continents of doing that, and it gives people a lot of room to be an individual within the community, which is ultimately what's important.
Do you have siblings?
I do have siblings. I have a brother.
A brother. And would you say, how is without speaking too much for your brother, would you say his journey was similar to yours in this space? Like, finding that identity within Judaism that might have been different from the way that your parents did or others in your life did?
He definitely found an expression of Judaism that was different to my parents, I would say, but it's certainly nowhere near similar to mine. His experience of school was really, really different. So he left with his two best friends from a Jewish school and went to Melbourne High. He's a psychologist which is a very people-oriented, curious, caring and listening profession, that I feel like in that respect is very much the product of our upbringing and our Jewish upbringing. A lot of the psychologists, the rock stars that he follows and knows deeply and goes to America to listen to and reads their books, are Jewish. Many are Israeli or related to Israeli backgrounds. They obviously have a lot of experience. I say obviously because it comes with the baggage, if you come from Melbourne, of the Holocaust or of trauma in one way or another, if they're Israeli or if they're from elsewhere. So I feel like his expression of the impact of our upbringing may look non-Jewishly oriented, but is deeply Jewishly motivated, I would say. But I also think when you grow up and you become an adult and you have children, at every different stage of your life, you can look back at your life so far, and there's a little bit more of it at each stage, and there's a little bit more context, and sometimes you have a little bit more distance and you can be a little bit more generous to your upbringing and maybe the reason that you ended up the way that you are. But he and I have talked a lot about that, and since the 7th of October, especially in terms of finding psychologists and then kind of saying, oh, this person's Jewish and this person's Jewish and this person's Jewish and that one's Israeli and that one's Israeli and that one's Israeli. And we've had very different reactions to that observation. But he very much leans into his Jewish upbringing in that way now, in a way that I don't think he did when he chose to leave the Jewish school. But saying that, he did a gap year in Israel and connected to the party scene there. That was very closely associated with the 7th of October, the kind of bands of the time, of the late 90s are still around now. And so that experience of understanding, of having been in Israel, of knowing that scene, hit him very hard as well, even though his experience of being in the Jewish community was extremely different to mine, and his experience of practicing Judaism is extremely different to mine.
I want to go to the now later on in the podcast for your story. So I will get to some of the current issues and what's changed. But before I let your little Adele go, young Adele go, younger, you talked about your upbringing. What was your relationship like with your grandparents? You mentioned that both sets of grandparents were alive with you growing up. What was your relationship with them like, and what are some of the things that stand out in your mind about that relationship?
So my mum's parents lived, my grandfather into his early 90s or mid-90s, my grandmother to 101. She only passed away last year. And they used to take us camping around Victoria, in the Zumsteins, in the Grampians. So we would see them in the holidays, and they would come on a Thursday and look after us. My grandfather was very passionate with maths and chess. He would play chess with my brother on camping holidays, actually, whilst I was on Habbo Camp, which was my youth movement. So for those that don't know, what is that? Yeah, so Habbo is short for Habbonim Dror, which is a socialist, Zionist, culturally Jewish youth movement, which delivers informal education. So that's games on a Saturday afternoon each week, and they run residential camps in the winter and in the summer. So I would be off escaping at the residential camps from when I was in maybe year 9, and my brother would go on holidays with my grandparents and learn chess. So he is amazing at chess and I am not. but I do like a residential camp.
And that camp is associated with the kibbutz movement as well, that type of...
Yes.
Yep.
So when I mentioned a legacy of creative responses to Judaism, that came from my youth movement background. I worked for that youth movement in the UK. That's how I ended up in the UK. So, and that was in my early 20s. Okay. So that's how I discovered a lot more about Judaism and Jewish literacy there. Okay. It wasn't actually from schooling.
Okay.
It was from being exposed in a community and kind of seeking it for myself. But yeah, that was my mum's parents. My grandma knows many languages, so she was really an amazing example of a lifelong learner. She was a teacher at high school, and my grandfather was a maths lecturer at Monash University. My grandmother told us from when we were a very young age about her students at the school in Brighton who were very disadvantaged, and she taught English as a second language to students who were born and raised in Melbourne, if you can have some context, in high school, who were barely literate. And she would always be telling us stories about that and about the students she taught in Russia and Poland, where she taught English, who also were very vulnerable and often hadn't eaten, so she would offer them, she would bring meals for her students. So we grew up hearing those stories from my grandmother on my mum's side. On my dad's side, my grandma would cook us Shabbat dinner every Friday, but her husband, my grandfather, died when I was 4, so he wasn't around in the primary school and secondary school and kind of university years.
Did they communicate and talk to you about their story before Australia at all? And both sets were in Europe during World War II and the Holocaust then. When was the first time that you were exposed to either parts of their story or knowing something about what they had gone through?
I did not hear about the Holocaust in a way that I would associate understanding about the Holocaust until I did a Roots project for school in year 6, and I was a child who liked to follow the rules or at least not get in trouble. So when we were told that we had to interview 2 sets of grandparents, that was my intention. So my dad bought a massive tape recorder that was as long as my arm, because that's what they looked like, and took it to his mother's flat, to my grandma's flat, and she refused to be interviewed. But she grew up in Warsaw in a Jewish day school, and her schooling was very important to her. The fact that she finished school was exceptionally important to her identity, and that I knew. So I begged her and said, I will get in trouble if you don't do this interview for me. So on that basis, she agreed, and she was interviewed in the kitchen, and my dad sat round the corner in the lounge room, and that was his first experience of hearing his mother's story, was that I followed the questions that I had been given from school. So it wasn't necessarily my curiosity. I was 11. It was just following a template, really. And so she answered questions to follow the template. And that's how we learned the basic structure of her survival in the Holocaust. Something she shared at that time, which was clearly very important to her, that stayed with me, was that when they received sweets, herself and her sister would eat them all immediately, and my grandma, Wanda, would save them. And that meant something to me because my younger brother obviously would gobble them up immediately, and I would save them so long that they actually went off. So I rarely was able to benefit from any lollies that came anywhere near us. But that story was an insight into my grandma, as you have when you're a child and you realise that your family members are actually real people, and the idea that she even had a sibling. I knew our family was tiny and I desperately wanted cousins. My uncle's 10 years younger than my dad, so I knew him when he was really young, and he wasn't married yet and he didn't have children yet. And I knew that there were other families who had lots of aunts and uncles and cousins, and that I didn't. But the reason for that wasn't clear really until I did that interview.
So the idea of the Holocaust as an event, I guess as a genocide, but in history in that we learn, you hadn't learnt about it separately from your family prior to that Year 6 interview?
No. I think now I notice that, for example, I remember when my older son was in the middle of primary school and a parent said to me in the playground, "Oh, I didn't realise we were telling the kids about the Holocaust and the Shoah." And I said, "Well, we're not." And this is the nature of a second generation parent conversation. Like, we're forging a new path because we learnt it in such an obscure fashion. We get the right to decide when our children hear about it. And the mum said to me, "Well, my child came home and said, Yona's great-grandparents are survivors." And so I asked what had happened, and it was a playground conversation where a different child had shared actually a very explicit story. So the other children responded and said, "Oh, my family are survivors too." So in some settings, you asked about the difference in a Jewish school and a non-Jewish school. I'm not sure that children in grade 5 in the playground are sharing the word survivor. But it meant that we understood as second generation parents, our children essentially were parenting us, and we were learning from them, right, they're starting to put together some weird puzzle that may not make sense, so we're going to have to play catch up. We were trying to protect them. We were protected, so we're protecting forward, but actually the world has changed. It's no longer appropriate. And so we need to provide some kind of a structure of education that's appropriate for their age. And obviously school provides that too, in terms of having, Yom HaShoah. There may have been Yom HaShoah assemblies when I was a child and I don't remember them. That's very possible. But what I do know is that I didn't sit down in class and hear dates and names. And in fact, when I went on my gap year, the first 4 months of the gap year was a kind of education program called Machon in Jerusalem, and there was a Holocaust subject, and there was a lot of assumptions about what we'd already know, and we didn't know facts. We knew emotion. We knew individual stories upon stories upon stories, and the subject I did in school in year 10 on the Holocaust was in fact an elective. So not everyone did that. And the information that was imparted, again, was a social history. It wasn't a theoretical, why do normal people do evil things? And it wasn't a faith or philosophical, why do bad things happen to good people? It was social, like here's a photo of a child, right, a response to that. And in my reflection, it's because the people who were our teachers were second generation survivors, where we're third generation parents now, but they were second generation survivors in the mid-90s. So if I was only finding out my story at that same time and my parents were finding out their stories, my teachers are the age of my parents. So now as a parent, I can see how it happened that the education that we received was so different to the education that our children are receiving, both from parents and from schools and from youth movements.
Thank you for that answer. It was, it's so interesting. And part of the reason for this podcast is to see how things have changed and developed and the ways that these lessons or information has been imparted to people. And the interesting thing is that you mentioned your grandmother's story as the first time but even your father in a formal manner had heard that story. That is something that I've heard many times, that it's not until the grandchildren come along and ask the questions that things are spoken away that explicitly. You mentioned sort of that idea of protection earlier. Do you think it was a protective mechanism for the kids, for the parents?
I don't know, and I don't know to what extent, and my dad would maybe have memories from being a child. I don't know to what extent the survivors who were friends with each other would have adult conversations away from the kids, so they would kind of talk about things.
That happened. Yeah,
I think on my mum's side, because miraculously her grandmother from one side, so her father's mother and her mother's father, both survived separately, not with the family. My great-grandfather survived separately and they found each other. So my mum didn't have a moment of revelation, but also my dad and my uncle, like at Shabbat dinner, a lot of my memory of Shabbat dinner, and I think my cousins who are much younger than me, their experience when they were much younger than me on a weekly basis, so after they did find out this information, was my father's a barrister and his brother also, so they're in court. So they would prosecute their mum every single week, banging their hands on the table and saying, when you were hiding for 18 months in the attic, did our dad have a beard or did he not? And how can you not remember that? And if he had one, how did he shave it? And she would week in and week out say, don't remember. She just wouldn't engage with it. So I don't know whether she was protecting them or whether she just didn't want to talk about it. And they came as refugees, before the word asylum seeker was invented. They were stateless. They didn't have passports for the first 7 years in Australia. They didn't have anything. So they were very busy full-time building a life until they could have enough of a life to have another child. So I think there's also the aspect of practical, that it takes all of your effort. They didn't speak a word of English, his parents. So I think that that's very different. Whereas my mum came here when she was 13. She grew up in Russia for the first 7 years of her life. My grandparents used to say that Russia after the war was more anti-Semitic than Poland in the Holocaust. So that's really saying something. They spoke Russian at home because Polish would give you away as being Jewish. And they had 24 hours to leave Russia and to get to Poland, and they had to do it in parts, like the family separated. And she lived with both of her grandparents. So what she picked up, her playground was World War II rubbish that hadn't been cleaned up in Poland. So her exposure to that was really, really, really different. And it wasn't an aha moment, because she was very, very close with her grandfather, and she would get a lot of her aphorisms and comments on life, and a lot of what she said more recently about anti-Semitism came from her upbringing and her grandparents' idioms and behaviours and comments. And she was around a fulsome family talking. But I think that the protection on that side wasn't about the information about the Holocaust. It was survival as Jews. And so even though her extended family all spoke Russian, but when she and her sister moved to Poland and woke up in the morning, they told me their entire family, mum, dad, grandparents, were all speaking Polish to each other, a foreign language that she'd never heard, with a completely different alphabet. You know, it's not just like all European, European language, like right. It's a very different language. Yeah. So she had to go to school the next day, having crossed the border and immigrated in a foreign language, and suddenly seeing all your loved ones not speak a word of that initial language, which is how they brought you up, with no explanation. But that was protective by them. They just didn't spell out, we are telling you this or not telling you that, because we are protecting you.
What year was that when your mum moved to Poland from Russia?
In 1959. Okay.
Do you mind telling what you know of your mother's parents' story?
So my grandmother, my mum's mum, had an elephant memory, and she was super interested in people. So she knew the stories of her own extended family, her grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, as well as my grandfather's. So I went through a period of interviewing her very regularly and documenting as many different people's stories as I could. She would often speak to my kids about the things that would be relevant. If she would ask them, what did you do today? And they'd say, we rollerbladed. She'd say, oh, that's like ice skating. I used to love ice skating until the Soviets, took it over, and then it was very hard to access. So that's the way that we would get stories. She said, oh, you're learning French. I learnt French. In fact, I loved swimming, and my father didn't want me swimming all the time because I wasn't doing my French homework. So that's how we would get the experience of her life growing up. She was the daughter of a dentist. My grandmother was a teacher. Her mother was a dentist. In those days, they called them dentist doctors because you'd come to them for anything that you needed pulling or sewing up.
Yeah.
And my grandmother would tell us that her mum would treat people at all times of day or night. They had the surgery in their home, as was what happened in those days. People would travel from other towns, but they would get there at night. So they would sleep on straw on the floor so that they could be treated in the morning. And that's relevant because my mum is a dentist who treats people at all times of day or night. She works from 8 a.m. until 10:30 p.m. 5 or 6 days a week. So we feel like the DNA is very strong on that side of the family. So my grandmother had her mother as a dentist, so very scientific and people-oriented, and her father was trained as a rabbi, and that was a way of being educated. He was one of 13 children, and he also trained as a pharmacist, as I said, overseas. So he was responsible for the spiritual and physical needs of their town. Both her parents, my grandmother's parents, treated non-Jewish people who would come. So they were very close with non-Jewish people. They spoke the language from the community around them. And my great-grandmother, she died in a bomb right at the beginning of the Holocaust, and along with my grandmother's sister. But my grandfather survived because the people that he had helped with medicines that they needed when they had infections and they couldn't pay. And he always said, just come back when you can. And eventually one of those families said to the people protecting them, if you don't protect this man, we're going to leave. Like, we're all going to be in danger. So that's how he survived. So my grandmother, they were religious, or at least he was a rabbi. So she got brought up by a religious father. I don't know how practicing her mother was, but I do know that she didn't like to cook. So I don't think she was traditional in any sense of the word of women at that time, but definitely in that side of the family, the value of hard work, whether you're a man or a woman, is very thorough. My grandmother's father was sent to school, was educated as one of those 13 siblings. His mother was a single mother because her husband died, and she was running a farm and selling stuff. She got that farm because she supported a Russian Revolution. So again, a hardworking woman. My grandfather was a single child, and his mum was an amazing cook who her husband was a businessman, and different things happened. He got taken advantage of, and she earned for the family by cooking and making a restaurant basically in their home. So she survived and continued cooking for the family until she died. So my mum is a very secular person, but her food tastes are extremely and unreservedly Polish and Russian, Jewish, nostalgic cooking. That's the household that she grew up in. My grandfather was at university, so he was away from Grodno, where they grew up, when it looked like the Second World War was starting, and he could hear on the radio, and so he started walking from his university over 2 days to come back home, and he sent a message to his mother that they were in danger and to go and get my grandma and to look after her. And sure enough, my grandma, that's when the bombs hit my grandma's side of the town. So they then remained together for the duration of the Holocaust. They survived through being protected by a non-Jewish woman that they had known. My grandfather's father took arsenic with him, enough for each member of the family, generous, and looking after the needs of the family the way he saw it. They were hiding in an attic before they were being hidden by this other woman, Maria, and he took the arsenic himself. So they were in the forest. My grandfather had to go into the town, put himself in danger to get a shovel to bury his father in the forest. And then the dogs and Germans had come there, and they didn't feel safe anymore. So they went to this other woman and they hid in a pig pen for quite a long time. And again, the way stories come out, I heard that story because my grandma taught me to knit, because it became cool. To me, at least, it was cool. And she taught me to knit, and I knitted because I was nervous very tightly. And she said to me, "Oh, you knit like your grandfather." And my grandfather wouldn't even make himself a cup of tea. I had to make the cup of tea. So I was really surprised that my very masculine grandfather knew how to knit. And I expressed that surprise. And my grandma said, "Oh, the way that we survived is that this woman, Maria, would bring us old army jumpers. We would unravel the wool, rebind it up, and knit jumpers for her to sell, and on that produce she would buy food for herself and for the family." He knitted. My grandfather's a mathematician, of course, so knitting is a lot about maths, and he learned to knit from my grandma in the dark, in the pig pen. So because it was in the dark, it was very tight. So that's an example of the weaving of kind of normal life and of accessing my grandparents' stories and memories in a way that wasn't sitting down and doing an interview. But anyway, that's how they survived, and they moved back to Russia after finding my great-grandfather. And as I said, as a pharmacist, because he had helped so many people, there was a lot of love towards him in general. And someone wrote him a letter through the Red Cross. They would find survivors who'd come to Australia and said, "Please tell me how I can help you." And So he said to his son-in-law, who's my grandfather, well, how can he help? And my grandfather said he can get me a job so that we can emigrate to Australia. So that's how my grandfather, a Russian and Polish maths professor, ended up employed at Monash University.
Wow, incredible. So when the war broke out and started, they were living in Poland, but where Russia invaded, is that right? Or was it, because I know...
They were in Poland.
In Poland. You obviously had Nazi Germany coming from the west and the Soviets coming from the east and partitioning and taking over Poland. And then obviously when Germany invades the Soviet Union during that war, then that becomes the territory that when the dogs were coming, and it's harrowing just to actually go from beyond you telling a story to trying to picture those places and how it would have actually been. Do you get overcome by thinking about that? Do you try to not put yourself like in that position mentally, or do you look at the fact that they survived and all the great things you've learned from them and special moments you've had keeps you going in a more positive manner? How does that work for you?
I spent decades, I'd say, being Holocaust avoidant. I can't handle anything where a parent dies. I didn't actually know the ending of The Sound of Music because my mum always turned it off before the graveyard scene, like at the part where they're doing the nice dance on stage. Yep. I thought that was the end until I was an adult. So that obviously came from somewhere that I have a real aversion to sadness in books and movies. It's too overwhelming for me. I don't want to engage with it. I read Elie Wiesel's Night in high school and kind of went into that was through school, and Mill 18 and those kind of texts that were available at that time. But after I left school and after I finished with learning in Israel, I really had a very strong aversion to Holocaust literature, Holocaust movies. I watched Shoah again, so I would put myself in the situation, but it wasn't out of a hunger or a drive. And even when I hear other people's stories today, I find it terrible, but I avoided those stories for a long time. And it's only more recently that I probably lean back in. In my book club, we have a phrase called cheeky Holocaust or sneaky Holocaust, which is slightly less jovial, where someone will suggest a book and actually there's such an aversion by so many of us to be reading anything to do with the Holocaust that if something has as its just background, it has to be declared, or when we've read it, we will be accusatory. You made us read it and you didn't tell us there was sneaky Holocaust. Yep. So we can now tolerate it enough to make a joke, but it isn't sought after in a way that I know that other people are interested. For example, my mother-in-law has a lot of curiosity and would often suggest this book or that book that's this part of the Holocaust, that part of the Holocaust, even if it's set in France. And I listen and nod and say, that sounds really interesting. And I know in my heart of hearts I will never, ever be reading that. And partly it's because there's enough sadness in one family, there's enough sadness in the families of my children's friends, enough sadness in the families of my own friends, that I don't have any hunger for sad fiction.
Your mother being the dentist she is and the hard worker that still works those long hours, do you think that her drive to do that is shaped by her parents and the legacy of them? I mean, I know that her grandmother was a dentist, so that could have been an inspiration, but just that idea of hard work and determination and helping others, because I'm sure I remember the first time we met was at a Shabbat dinner at your house, and I think at one part of the night you said, "Oh, I think Stephen, your dad was going to go and pick up your mum," and I'm like, "Oh, from where?" And you're like, "Dad, from work." and well, yeah, it was a Friday night and late, and yeah, like, you know, if someone needs something done, you know, time doesn't really stop. So where did that? You know, I don't think I've marked late before, but I won't make a habit of it. So what's going on there?
I think that we were brought up with education is the one thing that no one can take away from you. So people do have a habit of getting degrees in my family as a happy place. And that is something my parents, certainly my mum, a mantra she tells her grandchildren: education is the one thing no one can take away from you. So the fact that it's about people taking things away from you very clearly to me is based in a trauma background and at the very least immigration story. In terms of working hard, I mean, you talked about Yad Vashem. The Jewish story extends far before the Holocaust, and that story was one of thriving and community and beauty and enlightenment and change and development and remaining modern, and also one of anti-Semitism. And I think that I don't know why my family has such a strong belief in hard work, certainly the other side of the family as well. My grandmother brought up the family while my grandfather had to do a second law degree, a decade and a half after coming as a refugee. I can't imagine how difficult that was. But certainly my mum had said, if you stop working, you'll die. My grandfather used to say that too. He stopped tutoring maths 6 months before he died. I believe he stopped tutoring maths because he was ill and then he died because he was ill. But when I think he was 92, the causal relationship is certainly interpreted as, you see, we always said never stop working. And essentially it's not about work for money, it's about doing something with other people. It's about contributing to community or society or your family. So it's about getting up in the morning and having purpose. There's a value for hard work.
I want to hear about your life when you get up in the morning soon and what you're up to. But before we do, I know that Stephen's told his story, the previous episode of this podcast, but is there anything that you'd like to share about what you know about like his family, his parents, and even of Stephen himself?
I do know that I find the Elwood community of the time of the early 50s to early 60s really interesting, and there are so many people who have such a strong connection to Elwood Middle School, to Elwood High School, just growing a school around a generation year by year as that generation age is really interesting to me. And hearing the stories when I bump into people and find out, someone's grandparent also went to Elwood High School and has these memories, a lot of them Jewish, in a way, a very secular environment that I think really replicated a different version, not like for like, a different version of what I imagine Warsaw was like. A very secular environment that was nonetheless extremely and thoroughly top to toe Jewish. So his whole flat, every flat in the building in Elwood had a Jewish family. They had a religious family next door, so they knew about keeping Shabbat and what others might need to do. They knew about building a sukkah. So I think that the stories that come out of Elwood really energize me. I'm curious about them. I don't think they're documented in the same way as some other aspects of our community, maybe because those people are the type of people who just get on with things and they moved on. But I know that there's a lot of different groups who come back together My dad is in one of them for a brunch from Elwood High, but I've heard of multiple others who come back to their roots and have something in common. And actually the thing they had in common was now 65 years ago, but obviously so impactful that it has remained with them and they want to reconnect even if they're not friends now outside of that connection.
You mentioned a couple of things there. So I'm hoping there's lots of listeners to this podcast and many of them may not be Jewish. So you mentioned Shabbat, or the Sabbath is the day of rest, is where it originates from, isn't it? And it starts at sunset on the Friday and goes until sunset on the Saturday. And I think most people have an awareness of that. And based on how religious you might be or want to keep Shabbat, you don't work or do certain activities on that day, but many do. But then you mentioned Sukkah, which is from the festival of Sukkot. Is that right?
It is.
Can you?
So a sukkah is a booth like in your backyard that has palm leaves on the top, and you would sit in it each night for 8 nights. And that's just of interest because when you live in flats, you can see down into people's gardens. Yeah. And my comment about keeping Shabbat is of interest because when there's festivals, there are some festivals that are longer than that 24-hour period when you still wouldn't use the lights. And so you might, if you would like lights and you live in a time before timer switches are invented, you might ask the kids next door to be turning them on for you or off for you if you need a little bit of help.
No, it's amazing. Just little insights there. And part of this podcast hopefully is a bit of education as well into just a little bit of these knowledge points every now and then. All right, I'd love to hear more about you and your journey now. You talked about being involved in schools, and I know you're in the not-for-profit sector and that you've done some travel and moved to the UK. Can you give a little bit of a background into, there's probably lots you want to share, but from after school until now in an abridged way?
I think you asked something about the impact of the parents or the values that they'd imparted. So I think that my interest in working with vulnerable people definitely sprung from observing the people that my dad was working with and an interest in legal aid, for example. In constant conversations, he would drive me to swimming, bless him, at 7 o'clock in the morning often as a teenager before school, and we would chat about the case of the day, and he would often tell me these terrible things that it sounded like people allegedly had done, and I would ask questions about this and that, and he would often say, I don't have to prove anything, like why would you make an assumption? Like he was very protective and defensive. He's a defence lawyer, so that's his job. And I think that over a long time I got to understand a sense of justice and compassion, and I was interested in pursuing them in my work. I was also interested in Jewish stuff. So I did an arts degree at Melbourne University, and I did almost every Jewish-oriented subject. I did a lot of Hebrew literature. So I went and did exchange at Hebrew U to finish off the degree and to get exposure to more subjects. And while I was there, I met some people who went to the same Jewish youth movement, Habonim Dror, that I did, but they were from the UK. The youth movement operates in about 20 countries. So they said, look, if you're not doing anything next year, the phenomenal thing about youth movements is that at the age of 21, you're in charge of other people's children, you're writing a budget, you're organising buses, you're working out how much food everyone needs, and you're managing the people who cook it. So you can do lots of different roles. You can run the education, you can run the logistics, you can liaise with the parents, and you can have done all of that by the time you're 21, but it's voluntary in Australia. in the UK, they pay you a salary and you do it after you finished university. So they said, look, we're missing a head of education. Maybe you can come and do that for 1 year. And I wasn't exactly sure. I thought maybe I'd be a teacher. I wasn't sure, and I'd finished my degree. So that's what took me to England. And then they asked a second year, and I stayed. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to connect with a lot of different people my age and slightly older from all different youth movements, and who were interested in feminist history and values and politics and music, and really push the things that I had been interested in but just didn't know enough about. So they helped me to access more information. And I learned another Hebrew phrase that means a lot to me is chevrota. So we learn in partnership. Jewish learning is rarely done alone, and most commonly in partnership with someone who you're likely to disagree with. So in that job, I designed a project with someone else who came from an Orthodox background, from B'nai Akiva was the name of the youth movement, where we learned in chevrota the portion of the Torah that you read every week, and we learned it from a secular, humanist, social justice perspective. So he came with lots of additional sources, and through those jobs I was able to connect with the Jewish part of what was interesting to me, but the social justice part of what was interesting was something that I wanted to pursue for my career. And I met through those people who'd done a master's degree in community work, and at quite a radical university in the east of London. So I stayed in the UK and I did that same master's that a few other people had done, and started working in the homeless sector, which was something that I'd been interested in for various reasons for a very long time. And in that homeless sector, I quickly realised that being Jewish was associated essentially with Israel. So very early it was very clear that at least in that sector, which is quite large in the UK at that time, I can't speak for any other sector or any other country or any other time, it was not great to walk around and talk about your kind of holistic identity. That's what I got used to. And then I changed sectors. So I worked in the refugee sector and in the benefits sector, but still always with vulnerable people. That was really what I felt enabled me to go to bed at night. And it was only when we moved to Australia and I worked in an organisation that worked with educational disadvantage that I chatted with someone who said, actually, in every single job you've done, you have scaled something up. Like, it might be the reason you go to bed at night is working with the community sector. That's your passion and forming community. It wasn't that I liked working with vulnerable people. I liked to form community. That's actually what excited me, because that's the vision of the world that I'm able to help create. But what wakes me up in the morning is scaling things. So it's working out how to make something small into something medium or big. And that involves working with people. So it brought together my interest in the Jewish community will always be. I love getting more literate, but my interest in community at all, I'm lucky enough to have the Jewish community to express that interest in community. I believe that humans are their best when they're challenged by their community and supported by the community. So if I can help and be of assistance to other communities and to other individuals to have an aspect of that challenge and support by community, then I feel like that's a career well spent.
Yeah, absolutely. When you mentioned that there was a connection that was automatically made from Judaism into Israel, was it in just the homelessness sector? Was that from other people that worked in the sector, not the homeless people themselves, but the people in that space working? Did that not follow you around to refugee work and education, or it did to a lesser extent?
I worked in refugee work in a Jewish organisation.
Okay. For non-Jewish refugees?
Yeah. I worked in the organisation around benefits in North London, which has a large Jewish community, and the head office, not my office, but the head office was in Hendon, which is a very Jewish area. So even though none of the other staff were Jewish, it didn't have the same problem. But by then I had just gotten used to separating life, and I didn't, for example, bring Jewish foods or talk about Jewish festivals. We went to Limud for many, many years, as first independently and then with our family, which is a Jewish learning festival of thousands of people. It's residential, 5 days long, and so I'd vanish at Christmas, Hanukkah time. I wouldn't be talking about where I went. I just got used to that. And I knew it wasn't comfortable because you would see when the newspaper was open, people would make comments. So that was the signifier that you'd understood, yeah, this is not a conversation topic that's going to play well. Whereas in Australia, the organisation for educational disadvantage that I worked for had a Jewish founder. And so even though there were aspects there that you would kind of see, all right, the paper would be open, Israel would be on it, and you'd think maybe we won't have a conversation about the news today and maybe just shut the paper in the kitchen. The fact that the organisation had a Jewish founder meant there was a certain amount of DNA left in the organisation. So I started cooking for every Jewish festival, and I wouldn't talk too much, but I would give Adele's interpretation in a sentence of each festival. So there were people who left after a number of years and would say, oh, I'm sad to leave because I know it'll come September and I won't be eating honey cake. You know, it'll come to June and I won't have a cheesecake. So I feel like that's a gift of across cultures, of giving an entry point to people to understand a bit of Jewish culture. And in fact, where I work now, which I continued that practice, so I cook for every festival, I bring it in, and it's great because then I get to be the definition. So Purim is the feminist festival, of course, because that's what means something to me. Yeah. And I feel like if people want to know beyond the feminism, they can go and have a look for themselves, but it's not my responsibility to give every different person's interpretation of each festival. Oh. If I'm cooking, then it's on my terms. And this year, for the first time, we have some Iranian colleagues, and they brought this whole beautiful platter for Iranian New Year, and they left a note to explain each of the different items, an apple, wheatgrass on the platter. And then, you know, someone else brought from their culture. And in many ways, I feel like food is an entry point for many people, and certainly I really appreciated learning about those other cultures from my colleagues.
Yeah, it's one of the great ways to share culture is through food and letting your guard down, usually in a nice environment and having a chat. And I think we see it in Australia with the Chinese restaurant opening in a country town, and all of a sudden that's their Chinese people are all right, you know, because there's, you know, whoever running the shop, and we see that grow and grow and grow, and it's something that's so important. And it goes back to that idea of assimilation in a country, of losing your cultural identity to then all get along, or we can actually embrace culture and identity to get along, knowing it's just a bigger question.
It is a bigger question because I say that I brought the food, but it was only when we had 3 Israeli interns come to my current workplace, actually in October 2023, timing, or November maybe they came, that I noticed that after that time, even though I would be cooking and bringing food, they walked around, they were young, like 22, 23, they would walk with their shoulders back, with their backs up straight. They would talk about laying tefillin, which for your listeners is complex, but it's a box with leather straps that mostly men will put on their heads, on their arms, and they were very secular, and I would hear them talking to people who come from Brisbane and had never met Jewish people before they came to our workplace in Melbourne, and let alone Israelis, and they say, oh, you wouldn't put the tefillin on, of course, and these young interns, yeah, of course, if someone offers, in Tel Aviv Beach, of course, and the complexity, and again goes back to that, hypocrisy and picking and choosing, but it was the pride that they'd come from Israel and were completely oblivious of what it is to watch yourself. And so they didn't watch themselves, and they would be talking loudly about the Oslo Accords and educating people on Rabin, who really, their age, that was not in living memory for them. And I was amazed, and it gave me some insight into, we just together celebrated food is a great entry point, but it's also very shallow, and it is not an entire identity. And I don't believe everyone needs to bring their whole self to work these days, but it was an insight into how we navigate the world as Jewish people in the diaspora, and a highlight of how it looks different to be an Israeli.
Yeah, and so when you saw that, have you changed any of your behaviours post their confidence? I think it surely would have had an effect on you through life to experience some level of anti-Semitism, whether it was someone pointing out something about Israel in the paper or other comments that are bandied around at times, versus seeing just after October 7 these Israeli men being proud and, I guess, whether it's oblivious or just don't care about, this is who I am. So have you had any changes in the way that you, maybe not even from them, but just from since October 7, have you changed the way you approach Judaism, Israel, your identity in your life?
I think many people would say, myself included, that since October 7 is a very long time, and also 5 minutes. So it's a very long and different journey depending on if it's a day that hostages are released, or depending on if it's the first week of shock. I think the way of reacting to the world is very different over that time. I don't think it can generalise. I went through different responses, I would say, from being, I told you I wrote a note for every Chag, every festival. It came to the first Pesach, Passover, after the 7th of October 2023. So that was April 2024. And I wrote the note, and I thought, what's it going to look like if I write, this is the Freedom Festival, here's some macaroons? They're going to say, oh, right, Jews are free and Palestinians are in an open-air prison. That's not going to play. That's not good for anybody. So I would rewrite the note, and I would rewrite the note. But at the end of the day, Passover, Pesach is the Freedom Festival. That first year I did write a note, but it was very vanilla. We would say parv, like if you're kosher, like not milk, not meat. It's just, it was a nothing. And the following year, which was this year, I thought, no, there is a festival. This festival has been of my people. My people left slavery for a reason. They didn't leave slavery just for no reason. They left for a vision, and that vision was to be a people in a land, and that's where they headed towards. This festival exists tied to the land that they went to. It happened in our history, so that's what I wrote. 3,000 years ago, a group of people left slavery, and they walked and they went to a land that they settled. And this is what we celebrate, have some macaroons. So, yeah, I've changed my response over that time, but I still believe, like my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents, that we have a Jewish community, we're in the Jewish community and we speak our language, but we also speak the language of the people who are outside of our community. And it's really important. I think I was very defensive for a large amount of time until I went to Israel in May last year. I had a headache all the time, permanent headache, when I would go to work, and I was really defensive because I felt under attack. So my way of responding to people, it wasn't what I was used to, and it certainly wasn't what they were used to of me, and it wasn't me being my best. And I went to Israel, and contrary to what people might feel, I landed and my friend picked me up from the airport and she was like, "Oh, look at your aura." And I said, "My aura, like I've travelled for 24 hours, I feel disgusting and I've had a migraine for months." But my headache had vanished and I was surrounded by my own. And those 5 days there, which were very impactful, and a lot of big conversations and a lot of silly normal conversations, I came back a lot less defensive and ready to be open and engage. And it doesn't mean I'm always my best, but I don't think that walking around with my shoulders back, only saying accept me as I am, I'm not sure that plays, and I'm not sure I want it to play. I don't know the answer to that question. So whether I'm more proud, I don't know, but I do say to my children, love yourselves, the same as my mum says. People make poor choices when they don't love themselves enough. It doesn't mean you need to be standing on a podium and telling everyone else how much you love yourself, right? But it does mean that you should feel comfortable in your identity. You don't have to tell everyone how comfortable in your identity you are all the time. You need to be at peace with yourself and your choices. And I think that I am.
Yeah, I think I need a trip to Israel. My headache might go. I'm not Jewish, and I can easily escape conversation. You know, if it doesn't come up, it doesn't come up. But yeah, I find myself in a position where I'm not always my best self and always who I try to be in a more professional, public environment is very different from what I tend to be with like my best mates or family members when conversations come up. And I do always reflect, and I was a bit hasty there or very defensive of Israel and not defending necessarily everything that happens, but saying that it's just an unfair distinction that this is Israel doing this one thing, and if it happened anywhere else in the world, it doesn't count, or it's too big to to go into at the end of this podcast.
I think holding progressive values at the same time as Zionist values is hard sometimes when you find yourself with feet in different communities. And I think that for you, I know that you have your weekday daytimes in a pocket in Hawthorne, and then your evenings and your weekends north. And so you are having a foot in different worlds. And similarly, I feel very blessed that I live in Caulfield and I spend my weekdays in the north. And even though that's not always easy, I like to know what's going on and what people are talking about. And so I really value that, even though it's not easy. So I can hear you in terms of I spend time in a different community and I hear things that I don't feel comfortable with, or I think are not based in reality or fact, and make no sense. And I probably blame social media like you do. And I think that I don't practice it all the time. And like you, I double think and I think, I shouldn't have said that. But I do think that when we're trying to convince people, educate people, is probably when it doesn't work. Whereas I think that I really like your interest in putting information out there, for example, in a podcast, storytelling. There are other ways to help people to maybe see a little bit of the version of the world that you see. But I think it's really hard when you recognise maybe an ugliness or an unfortunate lens and are not able to do in close people to you or in people around you that you're not able to really do anything about.
I love that answer, and thank you, because it reaffirms, like, doing a podcast like this or those human to human conversations. And what works, as you said, really well is just hearing someone else's story and a perspective without trying to convince or educate, which I tend to always try and do. It's my logical brain that comes out way more than my emotional side or that caring side, although it's there somewhere.
I do think that the Holocaust background of so many Jews in Melbourne, and so I can't talk about the other Jews, but I can talk about myself, has given we thought it gave us a sense of social justice and a drive to create meaning in the world and a better world, generation upon generation, and inform our choices of how we spend our time. I think we didn't necessarily, at least in my age and maybe my parents' age, I'll speak for my age, I grew up in the time of when I was at a Zionist youth movement. All we talked about was Oslo. Our identity was very optimistic. It was very hopeful about Israel and therefore about our Jewish world, our Jewish selves. And I think that recognising that a lot of our responses more recently come from a place of trauma that already existed in us, that we actually just for the sake of convenience had not had to recognise. And a lot of our defensive responses come from a place of trauma that we have inherited in the way that we were brought up and in our stories. I think that came as a very, very big surprise and an identity, like an affront to our identity. And that is something that when I see my friends over a coffee, week in and week out after yoga, that topic of who we've found ourselves to be and not wanting to be victims, but recognising that some of our responses come from a place of trauma has been a surprise to the identity and something to chew over more than one almond chai.
In the space that you work in, and it's social justice, it's giving back in many ways, I find that there's some people, because of the social justice scene or the activist scene, at times, and in some places very explicitly, becoming anti-Jew or anti-Semitic, that those people want to move away from that space and maybe not contribute as much as they once did or would have. What has kept you, I mean, you've spoken a little bit about it, but what's something that you're proud of to be able to continue the work that you do and live the life of contribution and that you do in spite of or in the face of maybe some of the negativity that you might find yourself surrounded by?
I'm exceptionally lucky that I work somewhere with very, very kind and special people. And I know them very well. And so I also know that they exist in the world of social media and news like everyone does, and echo chambers like everyone does, and are exposed to a certain amount of information that kind of checks their values. So I separate how I know that they respond about Israel from the impact that they have on the larger world, which I have a deep respect for, and their compassion. And I also know that knowing Jewish people, as you say, the human to human, makes a huge difference to people's experience and interpretation, because I know that they know me and they have respect for the way that I am in the world and understand that, oh, this is a Jewish person doing good things and that can help. I think that the experience of anti-Semitism, which is expressed often in shady ways about Israel, has been complicated to get my head around, but I do now feel confident that when I hear something coded or strange that I now can feel like, yep, that's in the anti-Semitism bucket. And I think to myself of my mum's kind of mantra that it's always been that way. Don't shut down in the face of it. Open, engage, be human, be part of the kind of community of humans, because that's the only good that will come, is to connect with other people. So that's what I do.
It's beautiful. And my last question was going to be, based on the name of the podcast there, Stories Unbroken, the legacy, what's lived on from the people before you. And I think you've actually encapsulated that with the message from your grandmother. But just the last bit is that you mentioned Yona earlier, your eldest son, and then there's Jesse as well. Part of this journey is the idea that from a rich history to an attempt to end that in the Holocaust, and then to the life that you have today, you've been able to have this life of contribution of being really connected to your Judaism, to Zionism, to your children and education and your work in the not-for-profit sector and elsewhere. It's really a beautiful way to end the podcast with seeing, your life, as a child, the stories that helped inform you and make you and shape you to the person you are today, and then to the life that you continue to lead and make this world a better place. So I really appreciate you being here, Adele.
Thank you for having me.
Their Stories Unbroken is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the founders of the Bialik community, who in 1942, a time of tragedy and horror for the Jewish people, and for so many others around the world, visioned and developed Bialik College as a new type of schooling for the youngest members of the Jewish community. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe, follow, review and share. If you would like to get in touch with me, you can email theirstoriesunbroken@gmail.com. Thank you to Bialik College and all the staff behind the scenes that have helped make Their Stories Unbroken possible. I'd also like to offer a special thank you to the Bialik College Parents Association for their support in the podcast, as well as to musician Adam Starr. Additional thanks to Yad Vashem and the Gandel Foundation. Please check out the show notes for links and any additional information. See you next time.